And welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you by our producer, IEJ Media, our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia. We'll tell you more about them in due course. I'm the former military officer, Ray Powell, here in California. In Arizona is the former diplomat, Jim Carouso. How are you, Jim?
Well, Ray, you've ruined my weekend again.
Well, I didn't actually have anything to do with that. Those orders came out of Washington, D.C. But, Jim, we're going to talk about something that we probably did not have on our 2026 bingo card of things to talk about on the Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific podcast. Even though Venezuela does touch the Indo-Pacific, it's not generally one of those things that we talk about in that context. But fortunately, we do have a couple of guests with us who know a lot more about it than we do. And they're here to explain what the hell happened on Friday night and why our audience should care about it. So let me introduce, first of all, we have Dr. Robert Burrell, or Rob, as we knew him very well back in Australia. He's a retired U.S. Marine Corps officer. He's an irregular warfare specialist with extensive special operations experience, including recently as an instructor at the U.S. Joint Special Operations University. He has served extensively in our podcast theater of interest, the Indo-Pacific, including a stint in Australia with you and I, Jim, as the Marine Corps attaché. In more recent years, Rob's work has focused mostly on the convergence of criminal networks and state power in Latin America, and of course, some specifically in Venezuela. Also here is, and by the way, if I screw any of that up, guys, go ahead and correct me later. Colonel retired Mike Burgoyne is an assistant professor at the University of Arizona who previously served as an Army attaché. So you're surrounded by attachés, Jim, in Mexico, and as a policy analyst at the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. He is a specialist in the Western Hemisphere security and transnational organized crime. He is also the co-author of the defense of Jisr al-Dorea. I don't know if I got that right.
That's correct.
A tactical primer on counterinsurgency. Rob, Mike, welcome. And I am going to throw this one out to Rob. We'll just start with Rob and say, hey, for those of us who are just trying to figure what just happened this weekend, what happened Friday night? And why should our audience care about it?
Well, Ray, thank you for inviting me to the podcast. What happened on Friday was a culmination of, almost 3 decades of a regime that was revolutionary, kind of hijacked underneath a communist banner for a long time. Hugo Chávez was a popular leader in Venezuela, and despite the fact that the economy there kind of tanked and it became an adversary of the United States, he was popularly elected. And when he died prematurely and kind of last minute, made Maduro the president, Maduro was not a popular figure. And so you've seen 2 elections that he rigged. The last one really kind of a proven, we'll talk about resistance leader Maria Corina Machado, but just remarkable how she was able to use her grassroots network to prove the vote count. And so last summer of 2024, there was an election, and Edmundo González, who ran in place of Maria Corina Machado, who couldn't run. She, of course, the regime told her she couldn't run. They won 67% of the vote. And then immediately Maduro said, that's not true, and I won, without showing any proof. And so there's over 60 nations who now recognize Edmundo González as the duly elected president. And Trump coming back into office really kind of spearheaded, hey, this is a threat to the U.S. I think Marco Rubio is really the master behind the scene of kind of what's happening in that area. It's a region he cares about deeply. And so they were going to confront this dictator and kind of reinstall some type of democracy in Venezuela, which was the will of the people last year. And so that became an incremental force. It was a pressure cooker that was created by the administration. They started with the maritime force. They went after drug boats. Then they Then they did a maritime interdiction zone, kind of a no-fly zone. I'm not really sure how strict that is. But in the end, when Maduro didn't step down, they went in with this amazing operation and snatched him up in 2.5 hours, just unheard of, unheard of. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit. But the real threat that Venezuela posed was not just a socialist regime, but it was a nexus between China, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, kind of a nascent nexus, but something that could grow into a problem for the U.S. over the next decade.
All right, Mike. Given all that, and we can debate the nature of the threats to the United States, what amazes me is that there was no surprise the U.S. was getting ready to do something. Maduro took extraordinary security measures, and yet in 2.5 hours, we snatched him without any killed in action, apparently minor wounded. How is this possible? Are we that good, or are they that bad, or is there something going on that we don't see?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer for that. I don't think we'll know that till we get the full kind of accounting on exactly what happened, and I don't know how much we'll actually ever get because some of that's probably intelligence based. It was a little surprising that they were able to put this together, and also kind of where Maduro was. When I was talking to some friends about this and about the likelihood of them being able to do this kind of operation, one of my friends was saying, "Well, the Cubans are really good at keeping presidents alive." And so, and the Cubans have been knee deep in Venezuela for a long time because for Cuba, post Cold War, the Soviet Union really propped them up. And so, when Hugo Chavez came to power in Venezuela, like they were getting oil imports from Venezuela that kind of kept them going because their economy was basically collapsed after the Soviet Union went away. So the Cubans, like the payoff for that, or the way they kept Venezuela going, was that they infiltrated every aspect of the government, the security services, the intelligence apparatus. And so the Cubans, everyone kind of figured, well, they're really good at doing this. They'll do a good job of keeping Maduro safe, moving around, all this stuff. But apparently they didn't do a good job as we thought they were going to do. And I think just also the skill sets that the U.S. military, especially special operations, have developed over the last, 20 plus years of the war on terror. We can do some amazing things right now. And I think the thing to add here as we talk about like what happened, we should expand that out a little bit to talk about kind of the broader picture, which I think is important for the whole world, is the way the U.S. did this. And it was done. Everything that's been going on has been unilateral, like completely unilateral. There is no kind of coalition of the willing in play here with this operation. You don't even have, as far as legitimacy goes, you don't have an authorization for the use of military force from the U.S. Congress. And if we talk about this as a law enforcement action, and that's kind of what's been said about like we're doing after terrorists as far as these drugs boats go. And then also with Maduro, well, he's a law enforcement target because the DEA went on this operation. If another country was to do that to us, we would consider it an act of war, right? So we're basically at war with Venezuela. We don't have an authorization for the use of military force from the U.S. Congress. We don't have an international backing within the hemisphere. And I'm happy to talk more later about the Monroe Doctrine and the security system in the Americas and how that works. But I think for the world, what the world is going to see here is that we have an administration that's operating on its own and leveraging the military in a way that isn't bounded by the U.S. Congress and isn't bounded by international norms and structures that we would think would bound U.S. military action.
Before we get too much into that, and I definitely want to, Rob, I want to go back to this question of special operations because, of course, this was, as both of you mentioned, this was an extraordinary operation. And, special operations as a command was born out of the ashes of the 1979 rescue attempt in Iran, Operation Equal Claw, which was a disaster, of course, but sort of spawned this effort to bring everything together. And we've seen the maturity, the maturation of special operations to the point where we're now able to do these things like the killing of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, or this incredible operation here. And one of the things that we heard General Kane talk about when he explained the operation. We talk about all the rehearsals that go on before, we've got a mock-up of the compound and all of those things. Talk a little bit to us, Rob, about what goes into an operation like this.
Well, I mean, this operation is so special in that no other country can do it. I mean, that's what really puts the fear factor on our adversaries, is that we can do something that no one else can do. Those capabilities are kind of threefold. I put three kind of major tools in that bag. One is we have a unified Special Operations Command. There's some other components I can't talk about, but it's a unified Special Operations Command element. That's not the norm in the world. Most militaries have their special operations kind of stovetype underneath their services. So that's a real strength. We can do joint operations like no one's business. We speak joint, and it's a luxury. We won World War II without joint. Okay, so we don't need it. But in operations like this, you can see the value of it. I mean, we're using, the Air Force for hitting strategic targets. We're using the Navy for hitting strategic targets. We're using the Marine Expeditionary Force as a kind of an enabler or supporter to the Special Operations Force. And then we have this unit to be unnamed. There's a few open source documents about the units that went in. But what makes us really special, I mean, I ran into this all the time. I mean, we worked with officers from around the world in Australia. We're no different from them. They're just as smart as we are. They're great folks. What makes special operations different in the United States is our enlisted and our warrant officers. They are by far the best operators in the world. Those warrant officers from the 160th that we're flying, they have more hours. They have more training than anyone else. And so they carried out an operation at night in the dark in a place they'd never been before in a way that's really unheard of. Now, the mock-up, the training, the mock-up, which you brought up, is good. But, in our attempts to rescue the hostages in Iran, we also did a mock-up. I mean, the mock-up's been a standard way of kind of training for a mission. I don't think that's particularly different from the way we did business before. I think what makes us different are those three pillars. We're joint, we have a unified Special Operations Command, and we have the most highly trained, proficient, enlisted, and warrant officers in the world.
All right, so we have this unique capability of special military operations, but they were being used, according to the administration, for law enforcement. Guys, have you ever heard of that being the case, of using military for law enforcement operations?
Yeah, I mean, you've got Colombia. Our support to the Colombians, a lot of that is geared towards law enforcement, counter narcotics. You get a lot of military partnerships throughout the hemisphere where the military is working with paramilitary law enforcement, with militaries that are doing law enforcement activities. I mean, the big comparison that's been going on with this operation is, Noriega in Panama, the invasion there in 1989. And I think, because we do care about the Indo-Pacific in this podcast, I think expanding it a little bit, the thing that's interesting about the law enforcement aspect is basically you can have, the Department of Justice or the State Department declare something a terrorist organization, and then you could also just have the Department of Justice bring charges against an individual, and you can have the justice system in the United States say this person's a criminal, and then at least within the U.S. justice system, this is going to create some kind of a way to go take action. And then if you use that law enforcement as an element of national power, that gives you a way to go after people all around the world that you've determined have broken the law, and that you're going to use U.S. justice to put them to go after them. But I'll add that, in this operation, the Venezuelans are saying some 80 people were killed, right? So this is a military operation. I know Marco Rubio has said that, hey, well, we're just apprehending this criminal. He's not the rightful, leader of Venezuela. That's fine. But so law enforcement is justification, but it's clearly a military operation. And so all those other people that were involved that got killed are going to be part of this military operation. So it gives the United States this kind of it's a way of doing business that I think if we use in other places, some countries are going to find that problematic.
Okay, so I definitely want to get into that, but first, Mike, I'm going to ask you about um, so now we're 2 days into this, almost, and what's different in Venezuela now than when we went to bed on Friday night? It sounds like the vice president from the same party is still running the country, kind of. Is that she's calling for the return of Maduro, so she doesn't sound like she's entirely on the team. Heard that she was maybe in Russia when all of this happened. It sounds like there's a bit of a rallying around the flag happening there. It doesn't sound like we plan to. I mean, this isn't exactly regime change. We don't seem to want to have any troops there, despite what the president said initially about running the country. Um, what has changed besides the fact that the president and his wife are now in New York?
Yeah, so we got Maduro, right? So he was the president, or the de facto president, not the legitimate president of that country. But everybody else that's part of that regime is still there. Diosdado Cabello's there. Delcy Rodriguez is there. Vladimir Padrino is there, the commander of the defense forces. So the regime is still in place, and I don't know what's going to happen next, right? And it seems very I can't tell you what our objectives are or where we're headed, and I'm not sure that there's complete agreement within the Trump administration of which direction to go. My feeling, based on having followed Marco, the Secretary of State, throughout this period, is that I think he's interested in having regime change in Venezuela. He's also interested in changing out the regime in Nicaragua, and then ultimately, his goal is going to be to get Cuba to change regimes, which ties into what's happening in Venezuela. But for now, it's kind of like, okay, so if we want regime change, how do we get there? And some of the discussion seems to be like, well, we're going to work with them now, but it's going to be under the threat of U.S. military action. And so, I mean, this might be a better question for Rob, but it's like, we did a great job on this operation. Can we recreate that again? Do we have the complete ability to just continue to go in there? And so Rodriguez doesn't play ball. Okay, well, we're going back in again, and we're going to get her now. How many times can we recreate it? Or do we have to go to precision strike then and just start killing people? Or how do we are we able to just kind of act at will there now? Or I'm not sure what the move is, other than it seems like it's military pressure to get the current regime to do what we want them to do. And I'm not quite sure what that is, but I don't know.
I think that's a good assessment. When we were all watching the press conference and Trump said that U.S. was going to run Venezuela, despite all the crazy crap he's been talking about recently, where I'm thinking, oh no, he's talking about taking the oil. Please don't say that, and then, hey, we're going to run Venezuela. I mean, he's reinforcing the narrative, right, of the leftist. But he's trying to energize his base, right? He's been walking a razor's edge on this thing, right? His base doesn't support it. The left doesn't support it. I'm just, it's been a balancing act for him. So that's what he's doing. But what I was relieved at was literally that the vice president kind of came in and filled the power vacuum. And you might say, well, why would you be relieved of that? It's because, as we know from 20 years, as we've all lived it, you got to have physical security. Who's going to be on the street? If you just decapitate the president and then you decapitate everyone else, who is going to provide physical security? That's the number one thing. And so someone has to do it. And so the remaining regime is who could do it. I do think Maria Corina Machado is the long-term solution here. It's kind of nice that I think that Trump kind of divorced her, because standing next to him, he's lightning rod at the moment. So maybe that'll help her popularity. But she doesn't have a power. She doesn't have control of the military. She doesn't have control of those functions. And so there's going to be a transition period. And so although it looks kind of, it looks weird and like this isn't going to work, what can work? This is something that is working at the moment. And we'll kind of see how it goes going forward. If we can work with if we were in Iraq, we're working with the Ba'ath Party until we can transition to democracy. I think that's kind of the analogy I would make.
All right. So you guys know Venezuela better than us. How is the Venezuelan populace? Are they going to just sort of go along with this whole routine?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The opposition. So the opposition's been a, and it's kind of interesting when we talk about like, well, who's going to secure this? So when we started getting into this, even before this strike, like my question was always like, okay, so we get rid of Maduro or we launch a series of precision strikes, and then the opposition just has a protest and walks in and takes charge, like how without getting shot at. This is not an armed opposition, right? So like they're not what you didn't see after Maduro was gone is you didn't see the opposition just rise into the streets and take control of the country. Maybe that's going to happen. I mean, best case scenario, there's some massive peaceful uprising and, there's flowers in the streets and like all of a sudden the opposition takes charge and Gonzalez gets himself in there and everything's great. And the security forces say that, okay, we're going to respond to Gonzalez and he's the rightful president. But yet, like, how do you I think that's why this problem's so complicated. Like Rob's saying is like, well, how do you transition out of this without this thing collapsing into complete chaos? Because the people that are left in Venezuela are the ones that stayed. The people that are partying in the streets everywhere, they're in Doral, they're in Spain, and these are the people that left. These are the 8 to 9 million Venezuelans that fled the country. And so the opposition that's in the outside of the country is of course going to be like, hey, this is great. The opposition can take charge. Everything will be fine. But we've heard that story before in places like Iraq. And, I don't know what's going to happen to the population. I mean, there's a best case scenario there, but there's a lot of really bad case scenarios where things really just kind of crumble. And there's a lot of different factions in Venezuela that could cause a lot of problems for anybody trying to control that space.
Yeah, this is a really complex problem. And I think the big difference here between the 1980 Panama invasion is that when we took the dictator Noriega out of Panama, he'd only been in power for 6 years. So the population understood what normal was, right? And so return to normalcy, those functions were there. The generations understood like, oh, well, this is what normal looks like. When we're looking at Venezuela, you've got almost 3 decades of folks who don't know anything other than the Chavista mechanisms, right? And so when the Chavista, regime comes out and starts doing their propaganda on the street, it's just blanket propaganda. It's like, well, that's because that's what we do. We solve problems by mobilizing and talking it up. They're going through the routine of what they know. Corina Machado, Edmundo González. I mean, look at the years they have on their faces. Those folks remember democracy. Most people in the country do not. So this is going to be a really challenging turn. And also, control of the country. Maduro didn't even control that whole country. This is an enormous country. You have ELN, you have the FARC, you have other folks operating there with impunity. You have Mexican drug cartels. Those are probably the easiest to tackle. But, to get real control of this country is going to take decades. It's going to take a long time, plus the corruption. This is the third most corrupt country in the world on the corruption index, like Sudan, South Sudan, and Somalia, right? When you grow up and you understand corruption, you operate in a corrupt environment. Trying to change it to not being corrupt is not an easy turn. It takes a long time to get there. It's a generational approach. So this isn't going to be a quick fix, and I hope the U.S. is in it for the long term.
Well, of course, what the U.S. is in it for is one of the huge questions, right? Because it's not really clear what whether we have any staying power at all, since we're not staying, or we didn't stay. We took the president left. So now, predictably, this has not been met with widespread applause around the world. Of course, naturally, we had a very strong reaction from China, but woke up this morning to see a pretty strongly worded statement from Anwar Ibrahim in Malaysia. I expect there will probably be. There was certainly ambivalence from a lot of other places like Singapore. And I expect we'll probably within, as soon as everybody gets back to work, we'll see a UN resolution, UN General Assembly resolution condemning the action, which I would expect will go very badly for the U.S. So but what that means is that everybody's going to be called upon to take a stand, yay, nay, or abstain. So what does that mean for U.S. standing in the world? What does it mean for U.S. influence in the world? What does it mean for U.S. credibility in the world?
I mean, so I think what we're seeing in the Western Hemisphere is what we're seeing everywhere else with the Trump administration. If you look at the national security strategy, it really is a move away from the structure and norms of the U.S.-led international order. Now, most people only know enough about the Western Hemisphere and U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere to talk about the 1823 Monroe Doctrine. It's because we all hear about it in junior high or high school, and that is literally like the depth of policy understanding in most of the community in the Beltway on what our policy is towards the hemisphere. And so just briefly, like you have the Monroe Doctrine was widely received in a positive way, including by Simón Bolívar, as being a good policy. It's a unilateral policy by the U.S. to keep European powers from coming in and colonizing or recolonizing. Everyone was like, this is great. Fast forward to like 1904, and you have Theodore Roosevelt does the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, he does this to kind of counter gunboat diplomacy in the region. In particular, in Venezuela, you have a crisis where you have three European powers come in because they're owed money by Venezuela, and then they threaten Venezuela with gunboats off their shore. This happens in Mexico. It happens all over the place. If you owe them money, they'll come in and they'll seize ports. Not unlike what happens in China with like the Opium Wars and how European powers seize port cities, right? So Theodore Roosevelt's like, well, we don't want these outposts from Europeans happening in this region. So he says the U.S. is going to assume this kind of policing power in the hemisphere. And so the Trump corollary is kind of like a throwback to Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. But what we don't talk enough about is what happens in the run-up to World War II. And that is, as we go into World War II, FDR comes up with a good neighbor policy, and he's like, hey, we're done with all this like unilateral action. We're going to talk to people. We're going to consult before we go invading and causing and doing things on our own. We're going to work together on problems. And they build this tremendous goodwill within the region, and you see that in the response in World War II. We have Brazil, Mexico deploy forces as part of the Allies in World War II. The rest of the region doesn't deploy, but they're very supportive of the Allies. No one fights on the side of the Axis. And at the very end of World War II, you have the Rio Treaty, which is a defensive pact that predates NATO, looks a lot like NATO, but doesn't really work like NATO. But it's a defensive pact within the hemisphere. And it's tied to the thing that happens in 1948, which is the Organization of American States Charter, which ties us all together in an agreement about non-intervention, which binds the United States to not intervene. And what the United States gets out of this is it gets a region that treats them like the United States is a legitimate power in the world, and everyone's on board with the United States being a leading power in the world. And so what we're doing now is we're saying, okay, the good neighbor, the OAS Charter, all of these multinational institutions we have in the hemisphere, we're going to tear those up. We're going back to unilateral action in the hemisphere. And that's kind of how we're going to treat the hemisphere. And the Trump doctrine it's even more aggressive than the Roosevelt corollary, in that it's kind of like, well, it's like the Melian dialogue, like we're strong, you're not, and so we're going to get what we want out of you. And the similarities to the gunboat diplomacy of like the late 1800s, early 20th century right now is impressive. We have a fleet off the coast. We're not really invading, but we have enough combat power to threaten you, to try to get you to do what we want. And I don't know how this is going to end, but if it ends in the U.S. just getting oil interests back, but Venezuela remains this kind of corrupt, illegitimate regime, then that really looks like kind of the old school policy that we had before. And so I think that's an important thing that we need to talk about, is this change in U.S. policy in the region. And it's part of this larger kind of national security strategy that the Trump administration has of kind of setting aside these multinational institutions and acting unilaterally.
Well, I wonder, though, if part of this isn't the fact that China is now the largest trading partner for many countries in Latin America, huge investor in many parts of Latin America, and the sense that we were losing that primacy position in our hemisphere. So, Rob, could you talk a little bit about what China's activities were in Venezuela, and more broadly, how embedded are they in the economies and the military, in the government of Venezuela and the region?
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for that question. When we look at the Indo-Pacific, we're always looking east, but I like to remind people that work in that region that Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, they're also in the Pacific, right? And so they all have ties to other Pacific partners, including China. So they have relationships with China, and those are really what are at stake here with the U.S. in terms of strategic competition right now. Some of those countries are leftists, right? Mexico's got kind of a leftist regime. Colombia is certainly a socialist leftist regime, and we've got some that are turning kind of towards the right at the moment, with Peru and Chile, Argentina. So there is this tug of war happening. How much influence does China have in the region? They have some, right? But when you look at Mexico, 80% of their trade goes north to us. So the U.S. has a huge economic footprint in the region. It has most control over things in the region. I know, folks are concerned about Chinese investment in the Panama Canal, but these are they're not, they're valid concerns, but these are not like China's taking over, right? They're just like putting their toe in the water. In terms of what China's relationship was with Maduro and with the Venezuelan regime, they were the largest purchaser of Venezuelan crude. So they did purchase the most oil from them. Part of that was trying to get their money back from loans that they gave to Venezuela that were never repaid. So they did do that, but Venezuela only does like 1% of the world's output. So it's not a something that they needed, right? And there's a glut in the economy right now. There's an overreach of oil output. They didn't have a military footprint or a military arms deal with Venezuela. You know how you know very well, Jim, how China does business. They like to do the slow creep in. So coming in and putting a military footprint into Venezuela they knew would not be good policy with the U.S. So they haven't done that. Iran has been doing military arms deals with Venezuela, so that's probably the biggest contributor. And from a Russian perspective, or to put that in perspective, the largest contributor of Russian influence has been Wagner Group in Venezuela, very similar to the Cuban missions there, really to kind of protect folks when they didn't quite trust the folks around them. They came in to do things like that. In fact, they were recently in Venezuela right after the maritime exclusion zone was put together. I hope that answers the question.
So, from our Indo-Pacific experience, what we've seen over and over through the years is there tends to be a concern about the U.S. prioritizing other theaters and deprioritizing the Indo-Pacific, or maybe failing to make good on its repeated pledges and stated interest in prioritizing the Indo-Pacific. So there is an interest in bringing the U.S. in as a counterbalance to the ever-present China. Is there such an interest in U.S. involvement in Latin America, or is there more of a concern that we will Bigfoot it in
You mean like militarily?
in any way?
I think there's been this complaint that the United States has been neglecting the region. I don't think anybody has that complaint anymore. I think I was in Mexico just a few weeks back, and my Mexican friends right now are pretty jealous of Brazil, and they were telling me like, we've committed ourselves, we've like hitched our wagon to the United States with NAFTA. We're completely locked in with the United States, and now we have this unpredictable partner we're dealing with that keeps renegotiating our trade deals and is threatening to launch strikes in Mexico. Whereas Brazil, really since World War II, Brazil has kind of soured on its partnership with the United States. Brazil had a policy of being basically like the sister country in the hemisphere or brother country in the hemisphere, the two great powers of the hemisphere working together. But then after World War II, they didn't get what they wanted from the United States as far as economic support and security cooperation. We were supposed to help them build their force, modernize their force, and we didn't really fully deliver. And so since then, they've been on this slow trajectory to expand, to change their portfolio. And so they're a BRIC country. With the BRICS, they've expanded their interaction with all these countries. All the countries in the hemisphere, I think, want to do more with the EU, and a lot of them are now working with China. If you look at the hemisphere as a whole, the United States is still number one, but like South America, the continent of South America, China is number one. And I was in Brazil a couple months back, and I was hanging out at a bar with a good friend, and I asked him, I was like, okay, so if something happened in Taiwan tomorrow, would Brazil show up? And he's like, absolutely not. He's like, no way are we showing up to help you with China in any way, shape, or form. He's like, we wouldn't even cut trade with China unless we absolutely had to, because you guys will never make up the amount of money we're going to lose from the amount of commerce we do with China. And then I also said, I was like, hey, well, what happens if we go into Venezuela? And he's like, well, Brazil, we're going to fight you. And I'm like, you're not going to fight us. And he's like, okay, we won't fight you, but we're going to make life as difficult as possible because we don't want the United States on South America, on the continent, because Brazil has been building up this kind of, they've been cutting away over this time where we've been doing the war on terror. Brazil has been slowly building up this kind of leadership in South America. They don't want to call it like that they're the hegemon for the continent, but they're building up their influence to the point where they're like, well, we're the main power on the South American continent. And so I think, there's a lot of countries in the hemisphere. This return to unilateralism, I think, opens the door to China, because countries in the hemisphere are going to be looking to not just the unilateral action, but also the tariffs that have been going on. I think a lot of these countries are going to be like, okay, how do I diversify my partnerships? Because I like the business of the United States, but I don't know if I want to risk unilateral action if I make somebody mad, and I don't know if I want to risk this tariffs if I make somebody mad in the administration. So I think for China and for India and EU, this really opens the door to fill some of those spaces that the U.S. is going to leave empty.
Well, it's a really interesting question what China does in reaction. And there's a big debate among the Asia analysts. Is it China's going to feel empowered that they can do similar activities since now, all bets are off, the rules don't apply? Or are they going to take advantage, as you indicate, Mike, that they can truly step up and be a leader of the global South by reaching out and say, we are the defenders of the global order? And if you are, we all served in countries throughout the world, in Asia, and you guys in Latin America. If you are a military or political leader in a small to medium-sized country, and you say, if I get across the runway to the United States, might this happen to me? Or if China starts being even more aggressive, might the same thing happen to them? And what do they do? Do they say, well, there's not much we can do? Or if you're a place like Korea or Japan, do you say, time to go nuclear? And the non-proliferation issue comes up. So, there are 10 questions there. Rob, answer any one of them.
Well, I think I already heard from today. I've been doing a lot of conversation with different folks today, and I can't remember who, but somebody's like, "Hey, I think Brazil's going nuclear." Yeah, I mean that is an interesting question. I don't think we're going to invade Brazil. I don't think we're going to invade Venezuela either. But it does make people other nations a little nervous. I think going back to what Mike said earlier, and this was a question you asked, Jim, the real paradigm shift that's happened in national security is this designation of foreign terrorist organizations. After 9/11, we created all these authorities for the president to use military force overseas. And this FTO designation has allowed this administration to pursue these actors in a legal sense, but with military force. And so that's what I think the world is looking at and trying to tackle is this the new norm? Or is this a change to the way the U.S. and other folks in the world might do business? I would caution the fact that Trump is going to be around for another 2 years, and there's no Trump 2.0 behind him, right? There's only one Trump. So this might just be a one-off, right?
Well, so I mean, Yeah. I mean, so the Bush doctrine was somewhat repudiated by the sort of the Trump movement, right? They part of the reason that he was attractive was because he said, oh, Iraq was a disaster. I'm not going to do that. We're not going to do nation building, right? But apparently, the one thing that's been consistent all the way through this is all these presidents like to have the authority to use military force under the 9/11 authorities, right?
Yeah.
Under these foreign terrorist organizations. Obama did it, Bush did it. It's been consistent all the way through. If Venezuela goes pear-shaped, is it possible that we finally see the course correction sort of back to, like, could we get a market correction in the political markets, as it were, so that people start saying, maybe we just don't actually want to have let the president have this much power. Maybe we need to sort of, maybe Congress needs to claw some of that back.
I mean, all of this is happening under Article 2. So the FTO designation by law does not come with an authorization for the use of military force. So this is all being executed under Article 2. We've far exceeded the 60-day window under the War Powers Act. This is a deliberate military operation that Congress has not approved. So Congress essentially has just completely abdicated its role. And
But
this is important.
It's the first time, right? I mean, Libya.
No, that's been going on for a long time. But I think what's really important here, whether you agree with, and I think it's awesome that we got rid of Maduro. And I would love to see, I think there's a smart way and a right way to do this. I don't think we're necessarily going that direction. But why we have Congress approve these things is because then the administration, if they want to conduct a war, or they want to do something, they have to go to Congress and explain, like, hey, here's the strategy. Here's how we're going to do this. And so you have Congress able to ask those questions. It sounds like the Gang of Eight wasn't even informed about this operation, even in the immediate aftermath of it.
Sorry, for our broad Indo-Pacific audience, the Gang of Eight being the leaders of the House and Senate on both sides of the aisle.
Right. So it's like, well, how can we have a good strategy if we haven't explained what we're trying to do to the American people and to the Congress to get the authorities and get approval to do it? And so I think that's why then you have this press conference with the president and the cabinet where they're like, well, we're going to take the oil, or we're going to run the country, but not run the country. It's all kind of happening in this kind of murky White House, setting. And no one's quite sure exactly what the plan is and what we're doing, how much it's going to cost. Those ends, ways, means aren't really, no one knows exactly what we're going to do. So I think, we'll see what happens with Congress. I'm not hopeful that they're going to be like, okay, we're going to start, using our authority to rein in the White House. And like you said, this hasn't been just the Trump administration. This is 20 years of the war on terror, where we've been conducting strikes whenever we wanted all over the world based on the authorization for use of force from Congress. So, this is an expansion of that. But it's hard to have a good strategy if you don't have to convince anybody of what you're doing. And so if we're doing this here, I think the precedent is like, well, we can do it other places as well. So I think that's probably something all people all over the world are thinking about as well. Who's next? Like if the Department of State can just say, hey, Marco Rubio says this group or this person in Indonesia is a foreign terrorist, and now they don't need an authorization to use force, they could just do it. That kind of changes the dynamic, right? That changes what the U.S. does globally.
Yeah, to all our Indonesian listeners, Mike is not predicting anything here.
I know nothing. I'm out of the military. I'm just a poor professor here guessing what's going on.
All right. So the other discussion that's going on is this is actually all preparatory to doing something in Cuba. We're going to cut off their oil supplies from Venezuela, cut off their money they're getting from Venezuela, and then that house of cards will fall. And I guess, Rob, what do you make of that theory?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. I think Marco Rubio, as a son of Cuban immigrants, for sure, has his heart on a new Cuba. What makes this operation in Venezuela and the one we did in Panama different is that they actually those two countries do have U.S. national security interests. Panama has the Panama Canal, which we don't want to lose control of. That's very important. And Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. Unfortunately for Venezuela, or for Cuba, it doesn't really have anything besides a cool place for resorts. I mean, it doesn't have critical national security interest for the United States, which is the reason why it's kind of just been left there since Kennedy. So I don't think that this, and I published last year in January about predicting we were going to go into Venezuela. I just pat myself on the back on that one. But the next target, because I'm trying to read Rubio and looking what he's published and what he put through Congress, the next target would be Iran. I think he's been supporting resistance and freedom in Iran for since the Green Movement in the 1990s. So I think that would at the time, I thought that would be, maybe the next place he would move. But looking at the wicked problem set, wicked is an actual term, it's an academic term. But looking at the wicked problem set that exists in Venezuela, this is going to take up all the administration's next 2 years. And there won't be any other future targets, I think, in this administration. We're going to be working on this for a long time.
Okay, I want to sort of
Well, can I weigh in on that real quick? Just because, there is kind of a wing in the policy space. It's not so. You have to look at like bureaucratic theory on what's going on in the Trump administration. I don't think everyone's on the same page, but I think you have like Marco Rubio, within the Pentagon, there's a couple folks that are in this boat, and then I was listening to some folks from the America First Center talk about this. But there's a theory of victory here, which is you shut down Venezuelan oil exports to Cuba, and then that means that the energy situation gets worse there, the economic situation gets worse, and then you get a change in regime in Cuba. Nicaragua is also in the mix there. They'd like to knock over Nicaragua. The idea is that you get rid of these regimes that these folks really don't like. And although Cuba isn't necessarily strategically important, there's a lot of very important voters in Florida that make it very politically important. And so I think, and then also just emotionally, like, Marco Rubio, like you said, Rob, like he cares deeply about, sometimes I feel like, does he care deeply about a lot of things? But I think he cares deeply about Cuba and changing out that regime. So that kind of policy, that theory of victory there are folks in the administration that see this as a stepping stone to getting rid of these problematic regimes in the hemisphere.
And it's not, just to add on to that, Mike, real quick, it's not just the military or other type of pressure that's being used within Latin America. I think Trump's policy with Argentina and helping the Argentine economy was also an attempt to keep regimes in place that are more pro-U.S. and more capitalist. So there is a more unified strategy happening.
I do want to, again, trying to maybe drag this back to the Indo-Pacific a little bit. In the Indo-Pacific, there are many countries and some U.S. allies in a very big way who put a lot of stock in international law and our favorite little phrase, the international rules-based order, right? If you look at what Japan has hung its hat on this, the Philippines hangs its hat on this, Australia is very interested in it. And as they've sort of seen the U.S. walking away from it, that's created a lot of anxiety out there. What is the mood in Latin America? And I know that's a big term that involves a lot of countries. I'm just generally speaking, how do people feel about this international rules-based order? Is it such a term of art in Latin America as it is in the Indo-Pacific?
I don't think so. I think most Latin American countries are so focused on their own domestic issues. They don't even work collaboratively with their neighbors on problem sets, whether it be migration, transnational criminal organizations. I mean, they have real issues and problems that they're trying to work with. I don't think it's the international-based order, rules-based order, is as much of a talking point in America. I will say that that order was broken long before Trump came to the administration, and so I think he just acknowledged it and verged off from it. I mean, our adversaries have been taking advantage of us in this space for a while, but that's my take.
I mean, what's interesting about the Western Hemisphere, and Ryan Berg actually published a piece about this where he called it the land that geopolitics forgot. I mean, it really is just kind of hanging out to a certain extent. Like they get involved; these countries have gotten involved in the past in some things, but it's just not enmeshed in that system so much. I do think they care about the inter-American system, like the Organization of American States, like non-interventionism, they have found a lot of solutions to, like, you don't see these big state-on-state conflicts because they've come up with a system to manage conflicts. So and also to deal with it afterwards, even if they do have like a border skirmish or something like that. So they care about that. They care about the inter-American system. They care about managing problems without violence. You'll see that over and over again in their discussions. The big problem they have in the hemisphere is there's a dynamic at work here between, they have the non-intervention, which is in every document that they have, and then they have the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which has been the problem in Venezuela, right? And some of these other countries where Venezuela collapsed into this authoritarian, narco criminal state, and all the countries in the hemisphere kind of shrugged and said, well, we can't intervene because of non-intervention. So you have these two dynamics that are at odds with each other. And then where the U.S. comes in is eventually, a lot of times when these things happen, the U.S. says, well, you guys aren't doing anything, so we're going to do it by ourselves, which then causes all kinds of other problems as well. But I was wondering, for you guys, because I would like to know this, how is China? So I imagine Colombia, because Colombia is on the Security Council right now. And I imagine Petro, because he is a hardcore left former guerrilla, like he's going to be like, bring up the resolution in the Security Council. Like, you mentioned this earlier, like, where's China going to go with this? Because like it's either like you said, defend the global South or get some sphere of influence for themselves. Like, where do you see them landing?
Well, Ray and I can debate it, but my view is they'll start off with taking the football and running with it as leaders of the global South. And if the opportunity arises to do something similar to what we've done, especially if we are bogged down in Venezuela, I would say they'll assert their similar version of the Don Roe doctrine and say things that happen in our sphere of influence is a matter for us to unilaterally take care of.
Well, of course, when you talk about Taiwan, I'm not sure this changes the game that much for them. I mean, their line has been Taiwan's an internal matter, period. It's just like if the U.S. had to take action in Columbia, South Carolina, it's the same thing, right? So in fact, there've been lots of propaganda out there talking about the fact that, hey, the U.S. has had its own renegade states, and we took care of that in 1861. So I don't know that this. I'm sure they will use it a lot in their propaganda, and they already are. And just like with trade, they are able to sort of then pivot and cast themselves as being the responsible great power that keeps to its agreements and doesn't upset the order and those kinds of things. So that's definitely happening. So I certainly see a lot of that.
Right. The difference is we're not saying these are our territories we're integrating in. We're trying to say Taiwan's ours, South China Sea is ours, Tibet is ours, Xinjiang is ours. So it's a different way of expressing their concern and control over an area.
Right. So I want to kind of wrap us up in this question of the famous David Petraeus answer that became a book, I think, is tell me how this ends, right? Now, I'm not going to call on you to tell me how this ends because Petraeus couldn't have answered it in 2003, so I'm not going to ask you guys to answer it in 2026. But just sort of give me some best and worst case scenarios. How could this end? When you sit and stare at the ceiling and wonder, where is all this going? What are the thoughts that are going through your head?
I think this could end really badly. We've been throwing out case studies, but Libya is another one where we didn't put forces ashore, and it's still broken into pieces, and we still have oil extraction in Europe, but the governance structures are broken, and you've got 2 civil wars that occurred. So it's not the same scenario, obviously, but with the different factions that are in Venezuela, the Venezuelan military underneath Maduro didn't have full control of the country. And so a new regime is going to have a challenge just getting control of the apparatus of governance, let alone trying to tackle transnational criminal organizations. and the FARC and ELN. All these problems that exist that need to be addressed in Venezuela, they're in the whole region. These are regional issues. It's going to take a long concerted effort to get after them. And so, when you open up the Pandora's box, you're not really sure what's going to happen on the other end. I do think that the most important thing we have to keep track of, and I hope Americans would keep track of as we go forward, is the narrative. It's not just what's happening with U.S. foreign policy in Venezuela. It's the narrative that's being created. If we lose control of the narrative, particularly at home, if we lose U.S. interest in Venezuela, which most Americans think is far away already, then it won't work out as well as it could for the Venezuelan people. And I think that's what I'm really concerned with.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea. Like, I feel like there's a million different variables here that could go one way or the other. I think best case, like unicorns and rainbows scenario is some kind of like opposition, rise of the opposition. Like people come flooding over the border from Colombia. The army just kind of gives up, or you have some kind of coup where you have elements of the army decide that they're going to stand down, and then the region, like the OAS, especially led by Brazil, who doesn't want the United States in Venezuela, they come together and say, okay, we're going to put together the peace force and come in with UN, signing off, and then we're going to do the transition that way. I think that's maybe like your best case, like, oh my gosh, what a wonderful world scenario. There's a million versions of this where there's no U.S. forces and this thing kind of collapses in infighting among the different regime players, including the insurgent groups on the border with Colombia. There's a version of this where, we did this operation was fantastic, but what if we'd lost a helicopter, or what if something bad had gone? Like President Trump mentioned this, like this could have gone really bad. Yes, it could have. Like imagine we're going in and we just bring enough force to seize Caracas, and then we install some people like with no it's hard to be legitimate when the Marines are providing your security for you. And then we end up with this like long standing kind of mosaic insurgency style situation. So there's a lot of like horrible scenarios. Not a lot of ways to get to the best case scenario, especially right now, because we haven't built this kind of international legitimacy that could maybe help us get a transition. Because like Rob's saying, somebody needs to provide security, and Maria Machado is not showing up with an AK to provide security, right? Like who's going to do it? Somebody's got to do it. And I don't know if anybody's ready to do it. And then I guess like maybe the mid path is we cut a deal with the regime that's currently in place without Maduro, and the United States gets its oil profits back, and no one's happy with it, and maybe the transition's promised and appears or doesn't appear. But like I said, there's a million different versions of this, and I'm not sure which direction it'll go. But it's just but the situation in Venezuela has been bad, and so we can just hope that it gets better than it's been, because it's been really awful.
Well, on that cheery note, I'm going to go ahead and let everyone know that our sponsor, of course, is Bauer Group Asia, a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. It does not, at present, specialize in Venezuela, so of course that's why we had such a mess there. Bauer Group employs unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. And of course, my co-host Jim Carouso is a senior advisor with Bauer Group. You can visit them at BauerGroupAsia.com. You should also go and keep an eye on our producer on X at his handle at Ian Ellis Jones. Of course, anyone who has been keeping an eye on Venezuela recently has probably seen, and if you're on X, you've probably seen all of his geopolitical graphics focused in on what has been going on in Venezuela. So you should definitely do that. Mike and Rob, starting with Mike, where should people follow you and your work?
I'm on LinkedIn, so you can check me out on LinkedIn. That's where I do the most social media posting.
Okay. Anywhere else? Any websites or anything that where you put up work?
That's it. Just on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. Rob?
Well, you can subscribe to my Substack, and that's where you'll see me comment on things pretty routinely, usually once a week. And then on LinkedIn, I'll be posting if I have any major publications or things that go by.
All right. And of course, if you want to subscribe to this podcast, please go to your Apple Podcasts or Spotify and sign up there. Or if you're on YouTube, you can hit that little bell and subscribe there. You can also follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn also. We are also on X and Facebook. Finally, you can email us at Indo-Pacific-podcast@gmail.com. That's Indo-Pacific-podcast@gmail.com. We do answer emails. And of course, please visit our sponsor, Power Group Asia. So for Mike and Rob and Jim, I'm Ray. And Ian, our producer, we want to thank you for joining us this time. And please join us again next time on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?